Some graves are forgotten. Some are abandoned. And some refuse to stay quiet. In a small Thai village behind an old temple, there is a grave that never dries. No matter how long the sun burns above it, the soil remains wet, as if something beneath the earth is still breathing. Tonight, we are not telling a ghost story. We are remembering a grave that is still crying. And the woman who never stopped digging. Chapter 1. The Grave That Never Dries. Behind an abandoned temple on the edge of Nakhon Pathom, there lies a cemetery that no one in the village tends anymore. The stone markers lean like tired old men. Roots crawl across the earth like veins. Even during the day, the air there feels heavy, as if sound itself does not want to travel through that place. At the farthest corner of the cemetery sits a grave unlike the others. It is always wet. Not damp from rain, not soaked by groundwater. The soil around it can crack from drought. Grass can wither to dust. Yet the surface of that grave glistens as though it is sweating. A thin sheen of moisture coats the stone day and night. When touched, the liquid is icy cold, colder than river water at midnight, and it clings to the skin like something alive. The villagers call it the Weeping Grave. No one remembers exactly when it began. Some say their grandparents warned them about it. Others swear the grave has been wet longer than the temple has been standing. Children are forbidden from going near it. Even the monks avoid walking that path after sunset. At night, the grave reflects moonlight like a shallow pool. And sometimes, though no one agrees on this openly, people passing the road behind the temple claim they hear a faint dripping sound. Slow, rhythmic, like tears falling into earth. The strange part is not the water. It is that the moisture never spreads. It never dries. It never sinks. It simply remains, contained within the borders of that single grave, as if something beneath the soil is endlessly producing it. The old women whisper that the ground is not wet with water. They say the grave is still crying. And whatever lies inside has not finished dying. Chapter 2. The Man Who Dug the Earth. Prisha had spent most of his life around the dead. Graves did not frighten him. Rot did not disgust him. He believed the only difference between the living and the buried was time. So when the village headman offered extra pay to clear the abandoned cemetery behind the old temple, Prisha accepted without hesitation. The other workers refused. They muttered excuses about bad luck, about spirits that lingered where prayers had stopped. Prisha laughed at them as he loaded his tools. Fear, to him, was just another superstition poor men invented to avoid work. The cemetery greeted him with silence thick enough to press against his ears. No birds, no insects. Even the wind seemed to move around the place instead of through it. He found the wet grave easily. It glimmered in the afternoon heat like a patch of spilled oil. The soil around it was cracked and pale, but the mound itself looked freshly watered. A thin mist hovered just above the surface, evaporating and returning in the same breath. Prisha crouched and pressed his fingers to it. Cold. Not the coolness of shade, the cold of something that had never seen sunlight. He wiped his hand on his pants and lifted his shovel. The first strike sank into the earth with a sound that made his stomach tighten. It was not the brittle crunch of dry soil. It was soft, dense, yielding, like the shovel had entered flesh packed too tightly to bleed. Prisha jerked the tool back. For a moment the grave trembled, almost imperceptibly, as if reacting to pain. A thin bubble rose through the wet soil and burst with a faint sigh. He told himself it was trapped air. Nothing more. He drove the shovel down again. Harder. This time, the earth exhaled. The sound came from beneath his feet, a long, tired breath that seemed to travel through the handle and into his bones. The moisture on the grave spread outward, creeping toward his boots. It carried a smell with it. Sweet. Metallic. Old. Prisha staggered back, heart pounding in a way that felt unfamiliar. He had opened hundreds of graves. He knew the scent of decay. This was different. This smelled like something that had been sealed alive and left to ferment in darkness. Behind him, someone screamed. He turned and saw an old woman standing at the cemetery gate, her hands shaking as she pointed. "Stop digging," she cried. "It hasn't finished yet." Prisha looked back at the grave. The wet soil was rising and falling. Slowly. like a chest trying to breathe.
Like and subscribe to Whispering Dark Tales for more chilling ghost stories.
Chapter 3. The Smell Beneath the Soil. The old woman refused to step inside the cemetery. She stood at the broken gate, her bare feet trembling against the dust as if an invisible line had been drawn there long ago. Prisha shouted questions at her, but she only shook her head, eyes locked on the grave like someone watching a wounded animal struggle to rise. "Cover it back," she whispered, "before it knows you touched it." The words irritated him more than they frightened him. He spat into the dirt and turned back to his work. Fear spread faster than disease in villages like this, and he had no intention of catching it. He dug again. Each shovel of soil came up heavier than the last. The wet earth clung to the metal, stretching in sticky strands before dropping back with a quiet slap. The smell thickened around him, wrapping his face like warm breath. It was no longer just sweet or metallic. It was intimate. The scent of blood sealed in a room with no air. Prisha gagged and tied a cloth around his mouth. Even through the fabric, the odor crawled down his throat. His eyes watered, his arms shook, yet something deeper than stubbornness kept him digging, a creeping need to see what could produce a smell that felt awake. At 3 feet down, the shovel struck wood. The sound echoed sharply through the cemetery. Every bird in the distant trees exploded into flight at once. The old woman screamed again, louder this time, and dropped to her knees outside the gate, chanting words Prisha could not understand. He brushed the soil aside with his hands. The coffin lid was swollen with moisture, dark and soft like skin left too long in water. Deep grooves carved its surface, dozens of them, running lengthwise. His fingers followed one of the marks. It was the width of a fingernail. Scratches. From the inside. A pressure built in his ears. The world seemed to narrow until only the coffin existed. His heartbeat slowed, sinking with a faint rhythm beneath the wood. Thump. Pause. Thump. Prisha froze. He leaned closer, pressing his ear against the lid despite every instinct screaming against it. For a moment, there was nothing. Then he heard it. A weak, dragging breath. Not the echo of wind, not shifting soil. A breath shaped by lungs. Something moved inside the coffin. The wood flexed beneath his cheek with a soft, wet creak. A whisper slipped through the cracks, too faint to be language, too deliberate to be accident. His name. Prisha stumbled backward, falling into the mud. The smell surged upward as if the grave had opened its mouth. The moisture spilled over the edges of the pit and rushed toward him, soaking his clothes, seeping into his skin with unnatural cold. The old woman was sobbing now, beating her fists against the ground. "It remembers," she cried. "It remembers being buried." The coffin shuddered, and from beneath the lid came a slow, patient scratching. Not frantic, not desperate, just steady, like someone who had learned there was no hurry anymore. Chapter 4. The Woman Who Was Buried Alive. The chanting at the gate did not stop. It rose and fell like broken waves, the old woman's voice cracking with every breath. Prisha crawled backward through the mud, eyes locked on the coffin as if looking away would give it permission to open. The scratching continued, patient and deliberate, carving the silence into thin strips. Then the air changed. The smell vanished. Not faded, vanished. One moment it suffocated him. The next the cemetery felt empty, scrubbed clean of scent. The sudden absence was worse. It was the quiet of a room after screaming. Footsteps approached. Prisha turned and saw the former abbot of the temple entering through the gate. The old monk moved slowly, leaning on a wooden staff polished by decades of hands. He did not look at the old woman. He did not look at Prisha. His gaze went straight to the open grave. His expression collapsed into something ancient. "You touched it," the monk said softly. Prisha tried to speak, but his throat refused to form words. The monk stepped to the edge of the pit and closed his eyes. For a long moment he listened, not with his ears, but with his whole body. The scratching beneath the coffin lid softened, as if recognizing him. "She is awake," he murmured. The old woman began to wail. The monk opened his eyes and spoke without turning around. 40 years ago, this village buried a woman here. They called her a witch because she knew the illnesses of their children before the fevers came. She warned them of storms before the sky darkened. Fear turned her into a monster in their mouths. Prisha felt the mud beneath him grow colder. They bound her hands. The monk continued. They sealed her in that coffin while she was still breathing. I was young. I heard her knocking from beneath the soil. 3 days, 3 nights. The sound never stopped. The monk's voice broke. We told ourselves it was the wind. The coffin answered with a dull thud from inside. Prisha flinched. The monk did not. She did not die quickly. He said, she died remembering every face above her, every voice that refused to dig. The wet soil around the grave began to ripple. Water leaked upward, slow and steady, filling the pit again. It coated the coffin like sweat returning to skin. That is why the grave never dries. The monk whispered, it is not water. The scratching resumed. Louder. Closer. She is still trying to come back, he said. And for the first time since arriving, the monk stepped away from the grave.
Like and subscribe to Whispering Dark Tales for more chilling ghost stories.
Chapter 5. The Knocking at Midnight. That night, Prisha could not wash the mud off his skin. He scrubbed until his arms burned, until the water in the basin turned cloudy and cold. Yet the smell lingered. It clung to his nostrils like memory. Every breath tasted faintly metallic. When he closed his eyes, he saw the coffin lid flexing beneath his cheek. He did not return to the cemetery. He told himself he was done with the job. But the grave was not done with him. Near midnight, he woke to a sound that did not belong inside a house. Cock, cock, cock? Slow, hollow, rhythmic. Prisha sat upright in bed. The room was dark except for moonlight leaking through the shutters. The knocking came again, not from the door, not from the walls. From below. The wooden floor vibrated faintly with each impact. His heart began to match the rhythm without his permission. He swung his legs off the bed and froze. His feet touched wetness. Cold mud spread between his toes. He jerked back, choking on a cry. The floor beneath the bed was slick with the same dark moisture from the grave. It glistened in the moonlight, slowly crawling outward in thin veins. The knocking grew louder. Cock, cock, cock? Something was striking the underside of the house. Prisha backed toward the wall, unable to look away from the spreading mud. A shape pressed upward from beneath the floorboards. The wood bowed gently, forming the outline of a hand. 5 fingers. Splayed. Pushing. The knocking stopped. For a moment, there was silence so complete it roared in his ears. Then the hand dragged sideways beneath the boards with a wet scrape, circling the bed like a predator learning its cage. Prisha grabbed a lantern with shaking hands and dropped to his knees. He held the light against a crack in the floor. An eye stared back. It floated in darkness, lidless, rimmed in mud. The pupil twitched toward the lantern flame, shrinking like something unused to light. Around it, fingers moved slowly, digging upward, packing soil into the gaps. The eye blinked. Mud leaked out with the motion. Prisha screamed and stumbled backward. The lantern shattered. Darkness swallowed the room. The knocking returned, faster now, excited. The whole house trembled. Through the noise, a voice slid into the air, dry, broken, forced through a throat that had forgotten how to speak. You opened it? The mud surged upward between the boards, and the hand burst through the floor. Chapter 6. The dream the village shared. The scream that tore from Preach's throat never reached the neighbors. By morning, his house stood quiet. The broken lantern lay on the floor. The mud was gone. The boards were dry, unbroken, as if nothing had forced its way through them. But Prisha was sitting in the corner, awake, knees pressed to his chest, eyes stretched wide and bloodshot. He did not remember how the night ended. He only remembered the hand and the eye. When the villagers came to check on him, they stopped at the doorway. Something in the air felt wrong, not foul, not cold, just displaced, like stepping into a room where a conversation had ended a second too quickly. Prisha tried to speak. Mud spilled from his mouth. Not a flood, just a slow trickle that dripped down his chin and onto the floor. The villagers stumbled back in horror. He coughed and choked, clawing at his throat, but no wound could be found. The mud evaporated seconds after touching the ground. By noon, The entire village was whispering. And by nightfall, they all dreamed the same dream. They stood in the cemetery. Not as visitors, as witnesses. The sky above them was black and swollen, pressing down like a lid. In the center of the graves, the wet mound pulsed gently. With each pulse, water seeped out and crawled across their feet. The earth split open. A coffin rose slowly from the soil, dripping mud like a body dragged from a river. The lid creaked. The sound echoed through the dream, vibrating inside their ribs. No one could move. No one could look away. The lid slid aside. Inside lay a woman wrapped in soaked burial cloth. Her skin was gray and stretched tight across her bones. Her fingernails were torn to the root, fingers worn raw from endless digging. But her eyes were open, watching. She did not sit up. She did not speak. She only breathed. A wet, rattling inhale that carried the smell of sealed earth. With every breath she took, the ground beneath the villagers softened. Their legs sank ankle-deep in mud, then to their knees. They tried to scream, but the mud climbed their bodies, filling their mouths before sound could escape. The woman's gaze passed over each of them slowly, memorizing faces. When her eyes reached Prisha, she smiled. Her lips split open. Mud poured out. The villagers woke at the same moment, choking. Every house echoed with coughing and cries. Lamps were lit, doors slammed open. And everywhere, on every floor, beside every bed, were wet footprints leading inward. Not out. In.
Like and subscribe to Whispering Dark Tales for more chilling ghost stories.
Chapter 7. The Child Who Saw Her Standing. By morning, the village no longer tried to pretend the dreams were coincidence. People gathered in small knots, speaking in whispers that died whenever someone mentioned the cemetery. No one wanted to say her name, though none of them knew it. They referred to her only as the woman beneath. Animals felt it first. The dogs refused to face the temple road. They whined and pressed their bodies against doorways, claws scratching at wood as if begging to be let inside. Chickens huddled in corners, silent. Even the air seemed to listen. It was a child who broke the fragile calm. Little Niran was playing near the well when he suddenly stopped. His wooden toys slipped from his hand. He stared past the houses toward the distant line of trees that marked the cemetery. His mother followed his gaze. She saw nothing. But Niran raised his finger and pointed. "She's standing," he said. The words were simple, spoken with the certainty children reserve for obvious truths. The adults nearby laughed nervously, asking who he meant. The boy did not look at them. "On the wet grave," he whispered. A wind moved through the village then, cold and damp. Several people felt their clothes brush against their skin as if touched by unseen fingers. Niran's eyes tracked something slowly stepping forward from the distance. "She's walking now." His mother grabbed him, pulling him close, but the boy struggled in her arms. Tears streamed down his face. "She's looking for the house," he cried. "She doesn't remember where it is." The sky darkened though no clouds had formed. A pressure settled over the village, heavy and intimate. Doors began to close one by one. Windows slammed. People retreated indoors without speaking. Niran's crying stopped abruptly. He went still in his mother's arms, head tilted slightly, listening. Then he smiled. She found it. That night, no one slept. They sat with lamps burning, backs against walls, eyes fixed on their doors. The silence stretched until it felt alive. Somewhere in the distance, mud shifted with a slow, dragging sound. Close. Closer. And just before dawn, every household heard the same thing. A wet footprint pressing onto their doorstep. Followed by another. Stopping right outside. Waiting. Chapter 8. The Coffin That Rose. The rain arrived without warning. It fell in a solid sheet, heavy enough to erase the horizon. Within minutes the village paths turned to rivers of brown water. Thunder rolled low and constant, like something large shifting in its sleep beneath the sky. No one spoke, but everyone felt the same pull. Toward the cemetery. Against their will, doors opened, feet stepped into the rain. Men, women, children. They walked as if guided by a silent rope tied somewhere deep inside their chests. The storm soaked them instantly, yet none of them blinked. Their eyes remained fixed on the line of trees ahead. Prisha walked among them. His face was pale, lips cracked, mud still hiding beneath his fingernails. He did not remember leaving his house. He only knew he had to see the grave again. Something inside him needed confirmation. The cemetery gates hung open. Rain hammered the earth, flattening the grass, filling old graves until they resembled dark mouths. But in the far corner, the wet grave stood untouched by the storm. The water on its surface did not ripple. It did not mix with the rain. It gleamed smooth and separate, like a mirror laid into the soil. The crowd stopped at its edge. The ground began to sink. With a long, sucking groan, the earth collapsed inward. Mud spiraled downward, dragging water with it. The villagers staggered back as the grave opened like an eye forced wide. The coffin rose slowly from the pit. It did not float, it climbed. The mud beneath it shaped itself into hands, dozens of them, pushing the coffin upward with patient strength. Fingers made of soil curled and straightened, lifting inch by inch. Rain struck the wood but slid away without soaking in. Deep scratches covered the lid. Fresh ones. They glistened. A crack split across the surface with a sound like bone snapping. The villagers gasped as a thin line opened down the center. From inside leaked the same dark moisture that had haunted their dreams. It spilled over the edges and hit the ground with a wet slap. And where it touched, the mud moved. The liquid crawled outward in searching tendrils, circling bare feet, climbing ankles. People tried to run, but the earth clung to them lovingly. The storm faded into silence. Even thunder refused to speak. The coffin lid shifted again. A strand of hair slid through the crack. Long, black, coated in mud. It dangled in the rainless air, swaying gently, as if stirred by breathing from within. A sound followed, soft at first, almost tender. A woman exhaling after a very long wait. The villagers did not scream. They could not. Their throats were full of the same cold wetness, rising inch by inch, sealing every voice inside their bodies. And the coffin continued to open.
Like and subscribe to Whispering Dark Tales for more chilling ghost stories.
Chapter 9. The Man Who Was Taken. No one remembered deciding to flee. One moment the villagers stood frozen around the rising coffin. The next they were running, not away from it, but away from what they felt crawling inside their own bodies. The mud at their ankles pulsed like a second heartbeat. Every step felt heavy, delayed, as if something beneath the ground resisted letting them go. Only Prisha did not move. He stood closest to the coffin, his eyes locked on the widening crack in the lid. Rain slid past him without touching his skin. The air around him felt sealed, thick and private. He could hear nothing but the slow breathing from inside. Inhale. Wet. Exhale. Closer. The strand of hair hanging from the coffin twitched. Another slipped through the gap. Then another. They gathered like roots searching for soil, brushing the mud at Preach's feet. When they touched him, his shoulders relaxed. Relief washed over his face. The villagers screamed his name from a distance, but their voices reached him as faint vibrations. Meaningless. The mud around his boots warmed. It climbed his legs gently, not trapping him, embracing him. The coffin lid lifted a hand's width. Inside was darkness so complete it looked solid. Yet from that darkness came movement. Fingers emerged slowly, gripping the edge of the coffin. They were worn to bone in places. Nails torn away, skin split and layered with packed earth. Each motion shed clumps of mud that fell upward instead of down, vanishing before they touched the ground. Prisha leaned closer. His mouth opened in recognition. No one heard what he whispered, but his expression softened the way a man's does when greeting someone he has missed for years. The fingers tightened. A second hand rose to join the first. Something pulled. Not outward, inward. Preach's body folded forward with impossible ease. His chest compressed like wet cloth. His scream never fully formed. It stretched into silence as his face touched the darkness inside the coffin. The darkness swallowed him. There was no struggle, no tearing, just absorption. A single ripple passed through his shape, and he was gone. The coffin lid slammed shut with a thunderous crack that shook the cemetery. The mud collapsed flat. Rain returned in a violent rush. Where Prisha had stood, his boots remained upright in the soil. They were filled to the brim with thick, glistening mud. It trembled once, as if settling into its new container. Then it stilled. The villagers did not approach. They watched from the edge of the trees as water began to bead once more on the surface of the grave. Smooth and endless. The coffin sank slowly back into the earth. And from below, faint but unmistakable, came the sound of scratching. Not frantic. Satisfied. Chapter 10. The ritual that would not hold. By sunset, the village had already decided. The monks would come. No one spoke Preach's name. His boots still stood in the cemetery, filling slowly with fresh wetness. Yet no one dared retrieve them. They remained like markers, proof that the grave was no longer content with memory. The former abbot returned with 6 monks before nightfall. They carried lanterns, sacred thread, and bowls of blessed water. None of them looked at the wet grave as they prepared the ritual circle. Even the bravest kept their eyes lowered, as if afraid that meeting the grave's gaze would count as invitation. The chanting began. It rolled across the cemetery in steady waves, syllables older than the temple itself. The sound pressed against the air, thick and vibrating. For a moment, the wet surface of the grave stilled. The moisture stopped moving. The earth seemed to hold its breath. Hope flickered. Then the grave answered. The water burst outward in a sudden surge, splashing across the ritual circle. The monks did not stop chanting, but their voices faltered. The blessed thread soaked instantly, turning dark and heavy. Steam rose where the water touched the lantern flames, filling the air with a sour hiss. The ground trembled. A low knocking echoed from beneath the soil, deeper than before. Slower, deliberate, each impact pushed a ripple through the earth. The bowls of holy water shattered without being touched. Cracks raced across their surfaces like veins. The former abbot raised his voice, chanting louder. The knocking matched him, beat for beat. The grave swelled upward, the mound rising like a chest drawing breath. Mud split open in thin lines. From those lines seeped the same dark liquid, flowing in careful circles around the monk's feet. The chanting wavered again. One monk screamed. His shadow stretched unnaturally across the ground, pulled toward the grave as if hooked. The others tried to grab him, but his body slid from their hands. He did not fall. He was dragged upright, feet carving trenches in the mud as he moved inch by inch toward the mound. His mouth kept chanting, even as terror broke his voice. The former abbot lunged forward and pressed his palm to the monk's forehead. The chanting stopped abruptly. Silence slammed down over the cemetery. The grave pulsed. Once. Twice. Then the dragging force released. The monk collapsed, sobbing, his shadow snapping back beneath him like a severed rope. For a heartbeat, nothing moved. The former abbot whispered the final line of the ritual and drove his staff into the soil. The wet surface hardened instantly. Stone gray. Dry. The villagers gasped. The grave had sealed. But beneath the sudden stillness came a sound so soft only the monks heard it. A woman laughing. From very deep underground. And the stone surface began to sweat.
Like and subscribe to Whispering Dark Tales for more chilling ghost stories.
Chapter 11. The monk who looked inside. The stone did not stay dry for long. By midnight, moisture returned in thin beads across its surface. It gathered slowly, lovingly, as if the grave were remembering how to cry. The monks remained seated in a circle, refusing to leave. Their chanting had weakened to whispers, but none of them dared stop completely. They all heard it. Breathing. Not from above, from below the stone. A slow inhale that lifted the surface by a fraction. A long exhale that settled it again. The former abbot's hands trembled on his staff. He had sealed graves before. Angry spirits, wandering ghosts, hungry shadows. They always fought. This one was patient. Patience frightened him more. The youngest monk in the circle, barely 20, leaned forward. Sweat streamed down his face despite the cold air. His eyes never left the center of the grave. "She's awake," he whispered. "Do not look," the abbot warned. But the young monk was already rising. Something pulled him upright, not by force, but by invitation. His expression softened the closer he stepped to the stone. The other monks reached for him, but their arms felt heavy, delayed, like moving through water. He knelt at the edge of the grave. The moisture parted beneath his hands. The stone softened. It opened without breaking, sinking inward like flesh accepting pressure. A dark slit formed across the surface. From inside leaked a breath so cold the lantern flames bent away from it. The young monk smiled. "She wants to be seen," he said. And before anyone could stop him, he pressed his face to the opening. The cemetery went silent. The breathing stopped. For one endless second, nothing moved. Then the monk screamed. Blood poured from his eyes in thin, steady streams. His body convulsed, fingers digging into the stone that now clung to him like mud. The other monks dragged him back, but his gaze remained locked on the slit even as they pulled him away. His lips moved. No sound came out. The abbot slapped him hard across the face. The monk collapsed, shaking. When his voice returned, it came as a broken whisper. "She's still digging," he said. The slit snapped shut. The stone hardened again. But the young monk's fingers kept moving against the air, scratching at something only he could see. His nails split. Blood mixed with the moisture already coating the ground. "She doesn't want out," he sobbed. "She wants us in." The grave answered with a gentle knock. From below. Chapter 12. The Confession Beneath the Rain. The young monk never stopped scratching. Even after the others restrained him. Even after his fingers were wrapped in cloth. His hands twitched against the bindings. The motion was small but relentless, the memory of digging trapped inside his muscles. He stared at the grave without blinking, tears mixing with blood on his cheeks. The former abbot turned away. He knew that look. It was the look of someone who had seen truth and could not put it back. Rain began to fall again, soft at first, then steady. It coated the cemetery in a gray veil. The villagers gathered at the gate, afraid to enter but unable to leave. They felt the weight of something unfinished pressing against their chests. That was when the oldest man in the village stepped forward. No one had seen him walk. One moment he was in the crowd. The next he stood inside the cemetery. Rain sliding off his thin shoulders. His eyes were clouded with age. But they did not avoid the grave. "I remember her," he said. The words cut through the rain. The monks fell silent. The villagers stared. The old man's voice trembled. But he did not stop. "She wasn't a witch. She was a midwife. She delivered half this village into the world." His gaze drifted across the faces around him. "She knew which babies would live, which mothers would die. She warned us. We hated her for being right." The grave pulsed. Water spilled over the stone in slow waves. "We accused her to silence our fear," he continued. "We bound her hands so she could not point at us anymore. We sealed her mouth so she could not speak our names." His voice cracked. "And when we buried her, we heard her screaming." The rain grew louder. The villagers covered their ears. But the sound forced its way inside them, a memory that was not theirs. They felt soil pressing against ribs. Felt lungs burning in darkness. Felt fingernails tearing as hands clawed uselessly at wood. The old man fell to his knees. "She died knowing we listened," he whispered, "and chose not to help." The grave exhaled. A gust of cold air swept outward, extinguishing every lantern at once. Darkness swallowed the cemetery. In that darkness, a woman's breath echoed, close, intimate, grateful. Not for forgiveness. For remembrance. The old man smiled weakly. Then mud poured from his mouth. It filled his throat in a single silent surge. He collapsed forward, body dissolving into wet soil before he hit the ground. The villagers screamed, stumbling back from the gate. Where he had knelt, the earth glistened. Smooth. Fresh. The grave had grown. And beneath the rain, faint but unmistakable, came the sound of scratching again. Faster. Stronger. Encouraged.
Like and subscribe to Whispering Dark Tales for more chilling ghost stories.
Chapter 13. The Rain That Would Not End. The rain did not stop. By morning the village paths had vanished beneath brown water. Houses stood like islands in a slow-moving swamp. The cemetery could no longer be reached by foot. It rose in the distance as a dark shape surrounded by rippling floodwater. And still, the rain fell. Not violent. Not storming. Just constant. Like a hand that refused to lift. Inside their homes, The villagers listened to it in silence. No one cooked. No one spoke above a whisper. The sound filled every space, crawling into their ears until it felt like the sky was pouring directly into their heads. Sleep came in broken fragments. And every time they closed their eyes, they were underground again. They felt the coffin pressing around them, felt water seeping through cracks in the wood. It soaked their clothes, their skin, their lungs. Each breath became heavier than the last. They clawed upward in the dream, fingers tearing, but the soil above them stretched endlessly. When they woke, their beds were damp. Not soaked. Just wet enough to prove the dream had weight. By the third day, livestock began to die. Fish floated belly up in the flooded fields. The dogs stopped barking entirely. They lay with their heads between their paws, eyes following movements no one else could see. The former abbot stood at the edge of the water, staring toward the cemetery. The grave was visible even from a distance. It rose above the flood like a dark mound refusing to drown. The surface glistened, perfectly smooth, untouched by rain. He felt it breathing. Each pulse sent ripples across the surrounding water. The flood moved in time with it, rising and falling like a second tide. The abbot pressed his staff into the mud and whispered prayers that felt small against the sky. Behind him, a family packed their belongings into a cart. They were leaving. No announcement, no farewell, just quiet surrender. Others followed. By evening, half the village had emptied. Doors swung open in the rain. Abandoned to the water, the cemetery mound stood taller now, visible above rooftops like a watching head. That night, the rain changed sound. It no longer struck roofs or water. It struck wood. From below, the villagers woke to a new rhythm echoing through the flood. Knocking. Slow. Patient. Traveling beneath every house at once. And with each knock, the water level rose another inch. Chapter 14. The first morning it dried. The rain stopped without fading. One moment it filled the air. The next it was gone, cut cleanly. Like a thread snapped in the sky. The silence that followed rang louder than thunder. Water stood everywhere, unmoving. The flood did not drain. It simply waited. The villagers stepped outside slowly. The air felt thin, washed, wrong. Across the drowned fields, the cemetery rose in perfect clarity. The dark mound at its center no longer glistened. Even from a distance they could see it. The grave was dry. Not damp. Not sweating. Dry as bone. A murmur rippled through the remaining villagers. Some laughed in disbelief. Others fell to their knees, sobbing in relief. The former abbot did not join them. He stared at the grave with hollow eyes. "It's finished," someone whispered. No one asked what it meant. They waded through the flood toward the cemetery, driven by the fragile hope that whatever had haunted them had finally sealed itself. The water parted strangely around the grave, forming a shallow ring. Within that circle, the ground was untouched by the storm. The mound looked smaller, shrunken, exhausted. The surface was cracked like old clay. No moisture beaded there. No breath moved beneath it. The air around the grave felt ordinary, painfully ordinary after days of pressure. One by one, villagers stepped closer. Nothing happened. No knocking. No smell. No cold. A man laughed nervously and touched the soil with his foot. It crumbled dry beneath his heel. Relief burst from the crowd in shaky waves. Some embraced. Some prayed. Some wept openly. The abbot remained still. His eyes drifted downward. At his feet, the water trembled. Not from wind, not from movement. From dripping. He followed the sound upward. Every villager stood with mud trailing from their legs. Thin streams of dark wetness slid from their clothes, pooling around their ankles. The floodwater at the cemetery's edge was clear, yet what dripped from them was thick and glistening. Fresh. The grave was dry, because the moisture had moved. The villagers noticed at the same moment. Their relief twisted into confusion, then horror. They tried to wipe the mud away, but it clung lovingly to their skin. The more they scraped, the more appeared. The abbot looked back at the mound. A hairline crack opened across its surface. From within came a breath. Not trapped. Not buried. Close. Behind him. The villagers turned slowly toward one another. Each of them was crying wet, dark tears. And the ground beneath their feet began to soften.
Like and subscribe to Whispering Dark Tales for more chilling ghost stories.
Chapter 15. The Woman Who Walked Out. No one screamed. The villagers stood in a ring of trembling mud, staring at the wetness pouring from their own bodies. It slipped from their eyes, their mouths, their fingertips, not in a flood, but in a steady surrender. Each drop that struck the ground softened it further. The cemetery floor turned to breathing earth. The former abbot understood first. "She isn't in the grave anymore," he whispered. The crack across the mound widened with a sound like tearing cloth. Dry soil peeled back in slow curls. There was no coffin now. No lid, no barrier, only a hollow space where something had been. Empty. Behind the villagers, a wet footprint pressed into the mud. Then another. They turned as one. She stood at the edge of the ring. The woman was smaller than their fear had imagined. Thin, bent slightly forward, as if the weight of soil still clung to her spine. Her burial cloth hung in strips, dripping dark moisture that never reached the ground. It vanished inches before touching it, absorbed into the air. Her face was calm. That was the worst part. No rage twisted her features. No hunger showed in her eyes. She looked at them with the quiet attention of someone counting, remembering. Her gaze passed over each villager slowly. Wherever her eyes rested, the mud flowing from that person thickened. They sank an inch deeper. Then another. No one ran. Their legs would not obey. When her eyes reached the former abbot, she stopped. He met her gaze and bowed his head. Tears mixed with the wetness already leaving his face. "We heard you," he whispered. "We all heard you." Her lips parted. The sound that emerged was not a voice. It was the echo of fingernails dragging across wood, stretched into language. The villagers felt the meaning rather than heard it. "You left me there." The ground answered her accusation. It opened gently beneath their feet. Mud rose around their ankles like welcoming hands. Some villagers tried to pray. Others called for forgiveness. Their words sank uselessly into the earth. The woman stepped forward. Each step she took was silent. Each step they took downward was not. The mud climbed their bodies with intimate patience. Knees, hips, chests. It filled their mouths before their final cries escaped. Their shapes blurred, folded, and disappeared into the soft ground without struggle. The former abbot was the last to sink. He looked at her as the earth closed over his shoulders. "Will it end now?" he asked. She tilted her head. For a moment, something like sadness flickered in her eyes. Then he was gone. The cemetery stilled. The woman stood alone beside the empty mound. The air around her shimmered with quiet breathing. Slowly, she lay down on the dry grave and closed her eyes. The soil opened to receive her. It sealed without a mark. By morning, the flood had vanished. The village was empty. Travelers passing the old temple sometimes stop at the cemetery's edge. They say there is a single grave there, cracked and pale under the sun, perfectly dry, until you step too close. Then the surface darkens, and a thin bead of moisture appears, as if something underneath has remembered you, and started to sweat. If you ever pass an old cemetery and find a grave that feels damp beneath your feet, do not touch it. Do not look too long. Some things buried are not trying to escape. They are waiting for someone to notice them. And once they know you've seen them, the earth may remember your face. Good night. Sleep dry.
Like and subscribe to Whispering Dark Tales for more chilling ghost stories.